When a group goes on a 2-year military hiatus, the industry expects silence. Labels pivot resources, fan bases scatter, and momentum quietly dissolves. That's just how the music business works. At least, that's how it's supposed to work. BTS didn't get that memo. While each member stepped away from the stage to fulfill South Korea's mandatory military service, something the entertainment world rarely accounts for, happened. They didn't fade. They accelerated. Solo records shattered, charts flipped, brands lined up, cultural conversations that HYBE itself couldn't have engineered unfolded organically, driven entirely by 7 individuals operating without a group promotional machine behind them. And HYBE, a company valued at over $4 billion, home to one of the most sophisticated idol management systems ever built, reportedly caught off guard by the sheer scale of what its own artists were pulling off independently. So the real question isn't whether BTS survived the hiatus, it's this. How did 7 men, separated by military assignments and solo schedules, collectively redefine what a music group can be, even when they're not together? The facts are sharper than the headlines.
Number 7. Suga, the solo tour that rewrote the rules. Before 2023, Min Yoongi, the man the world knows as Suga and the underground rap community knows as August D, had spent years building a parallel identity. While BTS was selling out stadiums as a group, Suga was quietly releasing mixtapes under his alter ego. Raw, confessional, unapologetically personal music that sat completely outside the polished K-pop production machine. His 2016 self-titled mixtape, August D, and its 2020 follow-up, D2, were released for free. No commercial agenda, no label push. Just music dropped straight onto SoundCloud for anyone willing to find it. Critics noticed. Fans devoured it. But the mainstream industry largely filed it under side project. Then came April 21, 2023. That was the release date of D-Day, Suga's first official studio album under the August D name, and this time it wasn't a free download. It was a full commercial release backed by HYBE, and it hit the Billboard 200 at number 2 in its debut week. For context, that chart ranks the most consumed albums across all genres in the United States, not the K-pop chart, not the World Album Chart, the main Billboard 200, where Suga landed at number 2, making him one of the very few Korean solo artists to ever chart that high on that particular ranking. The album featured a striking range of collaborators, including a posthumous verse from Juice WRLD on the track Haiku, a pairing that would have seemed unlikely on paper, but landed with critics as one of the more emotionally cohesive moments on the record. But the album was only half the story. What followed was the Suga August D Tour, his first ever solo world tour, and one that immediately distinguished itself from the typical K-pop solo venture. The tour was not a modest arena run. It spanned 4 countries across 2 continents, covering South Korea, Japan, and multiple major cities across the United States, including Seattle, Newark, Chicago, Fort Worth, and Los Angeles. By the time the last date wrapped, the tour had drawn an audience of over 310,000 attendees in total. A figure that would be impressive for any established Western solo act, let alone an artist doing his very first independent tour outside of a group. The scale of the venues told its own story. In the United States, Suga performed at the Kia Forum in Inglewood, California, a 17,500 capacity arena that has hosted acts like Madonna, Kendrick Lamar, and Beyoncé. He sold it out. In Newark, New Jersey, he performed at the Prudential Center, another major arena, sold out again. In Tokyo, he played at the Tokyo Dome City Hall, and in Osaka at the Mishima Sonic Park, both significant live music venues in Japan's competitive concert landscape.
What made the tour particularly noteworthy wasn't just the attendance numbers, it was the type of audience that showed up. Reviews and fan-documented footage from multiple stops showed crowds that weren't exclusively the core BTS fandom. There were hip-hop listeners who had followed August D since the 2016 mixtape days. There were casual fans who had been brought in by D-Day. And there were first-time concertgoers who had simply heard the album and wanted to see what this person was about live. That kind of audience diversity is something that solo breakout tours rarely achieve, and it pointed to a genuine broadening of Suga's reach beyond the BTS ecosystem. The performances themselves received strong reviews from concert critics who attended in the United States. Several noted that Suga's stage presence as a solo performer was notably different from his role within BTS, more stripped back, more direct, more rooted in the aesthetic of a rapper who had built his craft in small clubs in Daegu before any of this ever happened. He performed tracks spanning his entire August D catalog alongside select BTS songs and incorporated live band elements that gave the shows a different texture than the choreography-heavy spectacle that BTS concerts typically deliver. It felt intentional, an artist making a clear statement that this identity was not a spin-off or a B project, but something with its own internal logic and longevity. In September 2023, Suga also performed at the Global Citizen Festival held in Central Park, New York, a free concert event that draws hundreds of thousands of in-person and streaming viewers and has historically featured artists like Beyoncé, Coldplay, and Usher. His set was broadcast to a global audience and introduced him to an entirely new demographic that had no prior contact with BTS or K-pop in general. Shortly after the tour concluded, Suga enlisted for his mandatory South Korean military service as a social service personnel, a category determined by a prior shoulder surgery. His enlistment effectively paused the August D chapter for the foreseeable future, which gave the tour a retrospective significance it might not have carried at the time. It was, for now, the final live statement of that particular artistic identity, and it ended with over 310,000 people having stood in those rooms with him. For an artist who once released music anonymously on the internet because he wasn't sure anyone would care, that number carries a specific kind of weight. 7 is closed, and if Suga's solo chapter can generate those kinds of numbers, what does that say about the members who haven't even reached the top of this list yet?
Number 6. Taeyoung, the man who made the fashion world stop and listen. There's a particular kind of credibility that comes from the fashion industry, and it is one of the hardest to manufacture. Luxury houses have spent decades carefully curating who sits in their front rows, who carries their campaigns, and who gets to represent the DNA of their brand to the world. These decisions are not made casually. They are made by creative directors who are notoriously protective of their aesthetic, their heritage, and their reputation. When one of those directors decides that a Korean pop star is the right face for their house, it says something significant, not just about the artist, but about the shifting center of gravity in global culture. In February 2022, Hedi Slimane, the creative director of Celine, one of France's most architecturally precise and critically respected luxury fashion houses, appointed Kim Tae-young, known globally as V, as the brand's global ambassador. Celine sits under the LVMH Group, the same luxury conglomerate that houses Louis Vuitton, Dior, Givenchy, and Bulgari. Getting tapped by any house in that portfolio is a statement. Getting personally selected by Hedi Slimane, a director known for his extremely exacting vision and his reluctance to chase trends, is a different category of recognition entirely. Slimane did not pick V because BTS was popular. He picked him because stylistically and aesthetically, V fit what Celine represents: a certain cool restraint, an instinct for silhouette and proportion, and an ability to wear clothes rather than be worn by them. That distinction matters enormously in fashion. Many celebrities become brand ambassadors through commercial agreements that are transparently transactional. The Celine-V relationship read differently to industry observers because V's personal style, documented obsessively by fans and noted by fashion journalists long before any official deal, was already aligned with the brand's aesthetic language. V attended Paris Fashion Week multiple times as Celine's representative, sitting front row of the brand's runway presentations.
Each appearance generated a volume of social media engagement that fashion houses could not purchase through advertising. When he arrived in Paris for the Celine Men's Spring-Summer 2023 show, photographs of his airport looks circulated globally within hours. Fashion publications including Vogue, Harper's Bazaar, and WWD, Women's Wear Daily, the trade Bible of the fashion industry, covered his appearances not as fan coverage but as legitimate fashion news. That is a meaningful distinction. When WWD is tracking your outfit choices, you have crossed from celebrity into cultural reference point. The quantifiable side of V's fashion influence is what the industry calls the V effect, a documented pattern where items he wears publicly experience rapid and often complete sellout cycles shortly after being photographed. This is not unique to him among major celebrities, but the speed and global reach of the effect is notable. Items ranging from luxury pieces to mid-range accessories have spiked in search traffic and sales within hours of being associated with him, a pattern tracked by fashion analytics platforms and reported by outlets including Business of Fashion. Brands that hadn't planned to feature a particular item in their marketing found themselves fielding orders they weren't stocked to fulfill. Beyond the Celine partnership, V's solo magazine presence expanded considerably throughout 2022 and 2023. He appeared on the covers of Vogue Korea, GQ Korea, Singles Magazine, and multiple international fashion publications, often photographed by prominent fashion photographers in campaigns that positioned him not as a K-pop idol doing fashion, but as a fashion subject in his own right. The editorial treatment in those shoots, the styling choices, the locations, the photographers selected, reflected a deliberate effort to document V as a fashion identity rather than simply a music personality who happens to dress well. His solo music chapter added another dimension to that identity. In September 2023, V released his first solo album, Layover, a jazz and R&B-influenced record that departed significantly from BTS's sonic signature. The album debuted at number 2 on the Billboard 200, and its aesthetic, from the album art to the promotional photography, was deeply fashion-informed. The visual world he built around the record reinforced the point that for V, fashion and music are not separate lanes, they are the same expression, channeled through different mediums. On Instagram, a platform where fashion influence is both exercised and measured, V's growth has been extraordinary. After BTS members created individual accounts in December 2021, V accumulated tens of millions of followers at a pace that placed him among the most followed Korean public figures on the platform. By 2023, his Instagram following had grown into the hundreds of millions, making him one of the most followed people on the platform globally, a metric that luxury brands weigh carefully when considering partnership value, because it translates directly into the size of the audience that sees the brand every time he posts. In December 2023, V enlisted for his mandatory South Korean military service, joining several of his BTS bandmates who had already entered service that year. His enlistment temporarily paused what had been an extraordinarily productive solo runway, both musically and sartorially. But the Celine partnership remains active, and fashion insiders have noted that the work done throughout 2022 and 2023 to establish his individual fashion identity was substantial enough to persist through his service period. What Taehyung demonstrated across these years is that fashion credibility, the kind that comes from creative directors and trade publications rather than from fan votes, is buildable. It requires consistency of taste, a coherent visual identity, and the ability to inhabit a brand's world rather than simply wear its clothes. By those standards, V did not just enter the fashion world, he gave it something to talk about. Which raises the obvious next question. If fashion bowed, what did the festival circuit do when J-Hope showed up?
Number 5. J-Hope, the Lollapalooza headline that redrew the festival map. Music festivals have hierarchies, and those hierarchies are guarded carefully. The headliner slot at a major American festival, the name printed largest on the poster,
The act that closes the main stage is not handed out based on streaming numbers or social media reach. It is earned through a combination of live reputation, industry respect, and the booker's belief that this particular artist can hold a crowd of tens of thousands of people who may not all be fans walking in. That slot has historically belonged to a very specific roster of artists: legacy rock bands, established hip-hop acts, crossover pop icons. The list of who has headlined the main stage at Lollapalooza, one of the United States' oldest and most prestigious multi-day music festivals, reads like a chronicle of Western popular music's last 30 decades. On July 31, 2022, Jungkook, J-Hope, put his name on that list. He became the first South Korean solo artist to headline a major American music festival, closing the main stage at Lollapalooza in Chicago's Grant Park. The festival, founded in 1991 by Perry Farrell of Jane's Addiction, had in its history featured artists including Red Hot Chili Peppers, Eminem, Kendrick Lamar, Lady Gaga, Arcade Fire, and Paul McCartney. J-Hope's slot placed him in direct lineage with that history, not as a novelty act or a cultural diversity booking, but as a genuine headliner, carrying the weight of the main stage on a Sunday night, the traditional closing spot of the entire festival weekend. The set itself was approximately 70 minutes long and covered 21 songs, drawing from his then newly released solo album Jack in the Box, as well as selected BTS tracks. Jack in the Box had been released just 16 days before the performance, on July 15, 2022, and debuted at number 17 on the Billboard 200, a strong opening position for a solo debut, particularly one that leaned into darker, more sonically abrasive territory than typical commercial K-pop output. The album's lead singles, More and Arson, were built on trap and alternative hip-hop frameworks and signaled a deliberate departure from the sound audiences associated with J-Hope through BTS. Arson charted on the Billboard Hot 100, extending his commercial footprint beyond the album chart. But the Lollapalooza performance was where the argument was made most forcefully. Not through statistics, but through the simple reality of what happened when he walked onto that stage. Reports from journalists and music publications who covered the set estimated the crowd at approximately 70,000 to 90,000. That number included a substantial portion of festival-goers who were not BTS fans, people who had come to Lollapalooza for the broader lineup and ended up at the main stage out of curiosity, proximity, or the cultural momentum that surrounded the booking. What they witnessed was a full production. Live band, backup dancers, elaborate staging and lighting design, delivered by a performer whose entire professional foundation had been built on understanding how a stage works, how a crowd breathes, and how to calibrate energy across a long set without losing anyone in the back row. Rolling Stone, one of the most established voices in American music journalism, was present and reviewed the performance. Their coverage was substantive and respectful, not the kind of cautious, hedging review that sometimes accompanies coverage of non-Western artists in Western music press, but a genuine assessment of the set on its artistic and performative merits. J-Hope had also appeared on the cover of Rolling Stone magazine ahead of the performance, becoming one of the very few Korean artists to receive that particular distinction from a publication that has served as a gatekeeper of mainstream musical credibility since 1967. Variety, Billboard, The Guardian, and numerous other international outlets also covered the headline set, generating a wave of coverage that extended the cultural conversation well beyond the festival grounds. The YouTube live stream of the performance drew millions of viewers globally, people who could not be in Grant Park but watched in real time as the set unfolded. That live stream audience included people in countries where access to live Western festival performances is limited, and its reach illustrated something important. The festival headline wasn't just a moment for Chicago. It was a globally witnessed event that carried meaning for anyone tracking the trajectory of Korean music's relationship with the Western entertainment industry. One of the more quietly significant aspects of the performance was the moment when the crowd, largely American, largely not arriving as declared BTS fans, sang along to lyrics in Korean. That is not a small thing. Language is typically cited as one of the primary barriers to non-English music crossing into mainstream Western spaces, and yet in Grant Park on that Sunday night, Korean lyrics were being collectively sung back by a crowd of tens of thousands. It was a data point that no chart position or streaming figure could replicate, because it was happening in physical space, in real time, without algorithmic assistance. J-Hope enlisted for his mandatory South Korean military service in April 2023 and was discharged in October 2024, marking a pause in his solo activities. But the Lollapalooza headline remained as a fixed coordinate in the map of what Korean artists have been able to accomplish on Western stages, not a ceiling to aspire to, but a floor that had already been established. He showed up to a festival that wasn't built for him and closed the main stage. If that's what number 5 looks like, the next 4 entries carry real expectation, starting with a solo artist who didn't just perform on global stages, but dominated the actual charts that those stages feed into.
Number 4, Jungkook, the solo debut that broke the Hot 100. The Billboard Hot 100 is the most closely watched singles chart in the music industry. It has been running continuously since 1958, measuring song consumption across the United States through a methodology that combines streaming, radio airplay, and digital sales data. In those decades, it has been topped by Elvis Presley, the Beatles, Michael Jackson, Whitney Houston, Mariah Carey, Drake, and Taylor Swift. The number 1 position on that chart is not just a commercial milestone. It is the most direct measure the American music industry has of what the country is actually listening to at any given moment. Debuting at number 1 in the first week of release is the hardest version of that achievement, because it means the audience responded immediately without the benefit of chart momentum building over multiple weeks. On July 29, 2023, Jungkook debuted at number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100. He was the first Korean solo artist in history to do so. The song was 7, a collaboration with American rapper Latto, and it arrived as a pre-release single ahead of his debut solo album. The timing was deliberate. Jungkook had spent years operating as BTS's lead vocalist and one of the group's most prominent individual faces, but had released very little official solo material outside. The streaming figures behind 7 were notable on their own terms. On Spotify, the song accumulated over 15.9 million streams in its first 24 hours of availability, a first-day record for a Korean soloist on the platform at that time. Across iTunes and Apple Music, 7 reached number 1 in over 100 countries simultaneously, a breadth of chart dominance that most Western artists, with the structural advantage of English-language radio access, do not routinely achieve. The song also topped the Billboard Global 200 and the Billboard Global Excl. US chart, confirming that its performance was not concentrated in a single market or region, but was genuinely distributed across the globe. The Billboard Global 200 performance was particularly significant because it reflected consumption worldwide rather than only within the United States, and 7 held the top position on that chart for multiple consecutive weeks, demonstrating not just a strong opening, but sustained listening. Chart positions can spike on release week due to pre-order stacking or fan coordination. Maintaining those positions in subsequent weeks is what separates a genuine hit from a statistical blip. 7 held. The collaboration with Latto was itself a meaningful choice. Latto is an Atlanta-born rapper who had established credibility in the American hip-hop scene on her own terms. She wasn't selected as a feature because of name recognition in the K-pop market, but because she was a legitimate chart presence in the United States whose collaboration would extend 7's reach into American radio programming. That strategy worked. The song received American radio airplay, which is historically one of the highest barriers for non-English language or non-Western artists attempting to break into mainstream U.S. markets. Getting radio rotation in the United States requires a level of infrastructure and industry relationship building that most international artists never achieve. 7 cleared that bar. 2 months later, in September 2023, Jungkook released a second pre-release single, 3D, featuring American rapper Jack Harlow. Like Latto, Harlow was a recognized name in U.S. hip-hop with genuine chart history of his own, having previously scored major hits including First Class, which spent multiple weeks at #1 on the Hot 100. 3D also charted on the Billboard Hot 100, giving Jungkook back-to-back entries on the chart from back-to-back solo releases, a consistency that reinforced the argument that Seven's performance wasn't a one-time surge. His full solo album, Golden, arrived on November 3, 2023. It debuted at #2 on the Billboard 200, the comprehensive U.S. album chart. In its first week, blocked from the top position by Morgan Wallen's One Thing at a Time, which was in the midst of one of the longest sustained chart runs by any country album in modern chart history. Debuting at #2 behind that particular album, in that particular week, is not a failure of any kind. Wallen's record was a commercial phenomenon, and placing second to it meant outperforming essentially every other release that week across all other genres. Golden also moved over 2 million copies globally in its debut period, a figure that reflects purchasing rather than just streaming, a meaningful distinction in an era when most consumption has shifted away from direct sales. For wider context, prior to the Golden era, Jungkook had already demonstrated his ability to perform in globally significant moments. In November 2022, he performed Dreamers at the FIFA World Cup opening ceremony in Lusail, Qatar, a broadcast event that reached an estimated audience in the hundreds of millions across 200 countries. The song charted on the Billboard Hot 100 following that performance, demonstrating an audience response even to a World Cup soundtrack cut that wasn't positioned as a mainstream commercial release. He enlisted for his mandatory South Korean military service in December 2023, closing the Golden chapter just weeks after the album's release. The timing meant that his entire solo campaign, from Seven to the album to his enlistment, was compressed into roughly 5 months. In that window, he became the first Korean solo artist to debut at #1 on the Hot 100, charted multiple singles simultaneously, and released a debut album that entered the Billboard 200 in the top 2. 5 months. #1. History. And still, 3 more members sit above him on this list, each with a solo achievement that commands its own specific kind of attention. #3. Jimin. The record that nobody saw coming. There's a specific kind of pressure that comes with being first. Not first among your peers, not first in your genre, but first in the full historical sense. The first person to do a thing that has never been done before, in a chart that has been running for 65 years, measuring the most consumed music in the world's largest music market. That kind of first does not come with a roadmap, because by definition, no one has walked the path before you. It comes with scrutiny, with disbelief, and in some quarters, with an immediate impulse to contextualize it out of significance. And then the numbers stay on the page, and the scrutiny has to find something else to do. On April 8th, 2023, Park Jimin's Like Crazy debuted at #1 on the Billboard Hot 100, making him the first Korean solo artist in the chart's history to reach that position. That sentence deserves a moment of stillness before moving past it. The Hot 100 had published its first chart in August 1958. In the 65 years between that first chart and April 2023, across thousands of #1 songs from hundreds of artists representing dozens of countries, no Korean solo artist had ever occupied the top position. Jimin was the first. Before Jungkook, before anyone else, Jimin. Like Crazy was the lead single from his debut solo album Face, released on March 24th, 2023. The song existed in 2 versions, a Korean-language version and an English-language version, both released simultaneously. This dual version strategy was deliberate. The English version carried the song's accessibility into American radio territory, while the Korean version maintained the artistic and cultural identity of the project. Both versions charted on the Hot 100, with the English version claiming the top position. The simultaneous charting of 2 versions of the same song by the same artist is itself an uncommon event on a chart that typically processes 1 version per title. The album Face debuted at #2 on the Billboard 200 in its release week, placing behind a single album that happened to be in the middle of one of the more extraordinary sustained chart runs of recent years. The same structural obstacle that Jungkook's Golden would later encounter in November. 2 on the Billboard 200, 1 on the Hot 100. Those are the coordinates of Face's first week, and they represent a combination that very few debut solo albums from any artist anywhere in the world have achieved simultaneously. The thematic content of Face added another layer to the achievement, because the album was not constructed as a mainstream commercial play. It was a deeply personal project built around the concept of self-confrontation, the process of looking directly at aspects of your own identity that are uncomfortable, uncertain, or unresolved. Jimin has spoken in interviews about the pressures of the idol system and the experience of becoming a global cultural figure from a young age, and Face was structured as a direct engagement with those pressures rather than an escape from them. Tracks like Set Me Free PT2, released as a pre-release single ahead of the album, carried a raw, emotionally direct energy that was audibly different from the polished warmth audiences associated with Jimin through BTS. It was a choice to show something less curated, and it paid off. Set Me Free PT2 charted on the Hot 100 in its own right, giving Jimin a Hot 100 presence before the album even officially arrived. That pre-release chart entry created a commercial runway that amplified the impact of Like Crazy's debut week, contributing to the concentration of attention and consumption that drove the lead single to the top position. On Spotify, Like Crazy set streaming records for a Korean solo artist at the time of its release, contributing to a first-day listening figure that reflected genuine global demand rather than a localized market push. The song also topped iTunes and Apple Music charts in dozens of countries simultaneously, a breadth of international chart performance that, combined with the Hot 100 position, confirmed that the song's reach was not dependent on any single regional market. What is worth underlining about the Hot 100 achievement specifically is what it required at a structural level. The Hot 100 is weighted heavily toward American consumption. Radio airplay in particular is a metric that has historically disadvantaged non-English language and non-Western artists, because American commercial radio has tight format restrictions and minimal appetite for programming that sits outside its established categories. The English version of Like Crazy received American radio airplay, which contributed to the chart methodology in a way that purely streaming-driven songs from non-Western artists typically cannot achieve. Getting American radio to play the work is a different kind of institutional validation than getting streaming platforms to host it, and it is a barrier that most international artists never fully clear. Jimin cleared it, and then stood at the top of the resulting chart. He enlisted for mandatory South Korean military service in December 2023, alongside Jungkook, in a joint enlistment that drew significant media coverage in South Korea and internationally. The two members enlisted together at the same military base, closing out what had been a remarkably dense period of BTS solo activity. Jimin's enlistment brought down the curtain on the Face era, an era that had opened with a historic #1 and demonstrated, in commercially measurable terms, that his individual artistry had a global audience entirely capable of responding to music made on his own terms. The #1 position on the Hot 100 is not a footnote. It is the headline. And yet, two more members sit above him, which says something very specific about the collective weight this group carries individually. What RM brought to the global conversation next was built on an entirely different set of credibilities, reaching into spaces that chart positions alone cannot measure. #2, RM, the collaborations that expanded what BTS could mean. There's a category of artistic achievement that does not show up on streaming charts or in first-week sales figures, but that carries its own specific weight within the music industry and the broader cultural conversation. It is the achievement of being taken seriously, not by fans, not by algorithms, but by other artists who have built their own credibility over years or decades and who are notoriously selective about who they choose to work with. That kind of validation cannot be engineered through marketing. It happens when one artist listens to another and decides that a creative conversation is worth having. when the artists extending that invitation are Erykah Badu and Anderson.Paak. The conversation carries a particular kind of. On December 2nd, 2022, Kim Namjoon, RM, released Indigo, his first official solo studio album, and the collaborator list alone told a story that music journalists spent considerable time unpacking. Erykah Badu is one of the most critically respected figures in American neo-soul and R&B. She does not make career decisions lightly. Her discography is built on an unwillingness to compromise artistic vision for commercial convenience. And her collaborations have historically been with artists whose creative vocabulary she finds genuinely interesting. She collaborated with RM on the track Forg_Full, a song that reflected Indigo's central thematic preoccupation, the process of trying to hold on to memories and identity while life accelerates around you. That Badu agreed to appear on the record, and that the resulting track reflected her aesthetic sensibility as much as RM's, signaled a creative partnership rather than a commercial transaction. Anderson.Paak, the Grammy Award-winning American musician and producer who forms half of the duo Silk Sonic alongside Bruno Mars, contributed to the track Still Life. Paak's reputation in the industry is built on musical fluency and a refusal to be pinned to a single genre, and his presence on Indigo extended the album's reach into a segment of American music listeners who follow his work closely and whose relationship with K-pop had previously been either minimal or non-existent. The broader collaborator roster on Indigo reflected the same principle across multiple cultural contexts. British R&B artist Mahalia contributed to the record. Korean artists, including Tableau, one of the founding members of Epic High, a hip-hop group that has been central to Korean rap culture for over 2 decades, also appeared, grounding the album in a lineage that predates and contextualizes BTS's own rise. The album was, in architectural terms, an argument that RM's artistic world was wide enough to contain all of these voices simultaneously without any of them feeling out of place. Indigo debuted at number 3 on the Billboard 200, placing it among the highest-charting debut solo albums by a Korean artist in the chart's history. That chart position was achieved without the pre-release single infrastructure that some of the other BTS solo projects deployed. Indigo arrived with less commercial scaffolding and relied more heavily on the album as a complete artistic statement rather than a hits delivery mechanism. The fact that it still debuted in the top 3 reflects both the size of the audience that arrived ready to receive it and the genuine critical interest the project generated across music media. The album's concept deserves elaboration because it was unusually self-aware for a debut solo release from an artist who could easily have leaned on his existing profile for commercial safety. RM has described Indigo as a diary before the end, a deliberate documentation of his late 20s, made before turning 30 and before the group's military hiatus began. That framing positioned the record not as a promotional vehicle, but as an archival act, the genuine attempt to preserve a moment of personal experience in musical form. Music critics who reviewed the album noted the consistency of that intention across the track list, and the reviews it received in publications including Pitchfork, Rolling Stone, and NME were substantively engaged rather than dismissively brief. This fits a pattern that RM has established across his entire career as a public figure. His 2018 free mixtape Mono, released without commercial infrastructure, available as a free download, debuted on the Billboard 200, making it one of the very few free releases in chart history to register on that ranking. The fact that a zero-cost release could generate enough streaming and consumption to chart on a commercial album ranking said something important about the depth and engagement of the audience following his solo work long before Indigo arrived. Beyond music, RM's cultural footprint during this period extended into territory that no chart can measure. He is a documented and serious visual art enthusiast. His visits to museums and galleries internationally, shared through his social media platforms, have repeatedly been cited by curators and gallery directors as generating significant increases in public interest and visitor traffic. The phenomenon has been covered by arts publications including Artsy and the Art newspaper, which tracked the correlation between RM posting about a particular work or exhibition and the subsequent surge in engagement with that content. His influence in the art world operates through genuine enthusiasm rather than brand partnership, which gives it a different quality than celebrity endorsement. He represented South Korea at the 76th United Nations General Assembly in September 2021, delivering a speech about climate change, youth, and the particular experience of a generation that had its formative years interrupted by a global pandemic. The speech was delivered in Korean, a choice that carried its own statement about linguistic pride, and was covered by international news organizations as a substantive policy-adjacent statement rather than a celebrity appearance. RM enlisted for mandatory South Korean military service in December 2023, joining several of his bandmates in the final wave of BTS enlistments that year. By that point, Indigo had been in the world for 12 months and had continued accumulating the kind of measured, sustained critical appreciation that distinguishes albums people return to from albums that peak on release week and fade. The collaborations he assembled on that record were not the kind you engineer. They're the kind you earn through years of demonstrating that you have something worth listening to. Which leaves one member, and his story doesn't start with a solo release or a festival headline. It starts with a door that everyone assumed had closed and then opens. Number 1, Jimin, the return that the whole world waited for. Every countdown has a number 1, and in a list built around breakthroughs, chart records, festival headlines, fashion houses, historic firsts. It might seem counterintuitive that the top position belongs not to the biggest streaming number or the most significant chart debut, but to a man who spent 18 months doing something that had nothing to do with music at all. Kim Seokjin served in the South Korean military. He came back, and the way the world responded to both of those things, the going and the returning, is what earns this spot. On December 13th, 2022, Jimin became the first BTS member to enlist for mandatory military service. South Korean law requires able-bodied male citizens to complete a service period, and BTS had deferred their enlistments while navigating the extraordinary logistical complexity of being one of the most commercially significant musical acts on the planet. When the deferral window closed, Jimin, as the oldest member, went first. He reported to the 5th Infantry Division of the Republic of Korea Army for active duty service, not social service or an alternative track. Standard military service with a training period and full deployment to a unit. Before he went in, he left something behind. On October 28, 2022, 6 weeks before his enlistment date, Jimin performed The Astronaut live with Coldplay at the band's Music of the Spheres World Tour stop in Buenos Aires, Argentina. The song had been co-written by Chris Martin specifically for Jimin, and its lyrics carried an emotional weight that the timing of its release made impossible to separate from the imminent enlistment context. The Astronaut debuted at number 51 on the Billboard Hot 100, a strong entry for a song positioned as a farewell rather than a lead commercial release, and its performance at the Buenos Aires concert, in front of a stadium of Coldplay's own audience, introduced Jin's voice to a room full of people who may not have arrived knowing his name. It was a remarkable final statement before a long silence. A globally broadcast performance with one of the world's most beloved bands, built on a song one of those band members wrote because he genuinely wanted to. Then Jimin went in, and BTS, for the first time in their collective history, was without all 7 of its members in active creative operation simultaneously. The 18 months that followed were defined by the solo activities of the other members, the chart records, the festival headlines, the fashion partnerships, the collaborations, all of which unfolded in the foreground while Jin's absence quietly shaped the emotional backdrop of everything. For an enormous global fan base that had watched this group operate as an inseparable unit for nearly a decade, the staggered enlistments of each member represented a different kind of waiting than any hiatus or schedule gap had produced before. Jin's enlistment, as the first, had established the emotional rhythm of that wait. On June 12, 2024, it ended. Jimin was discharged from the South Korean military at the 5th Infantry Division base in Yongkyeon, Gyeonggi Province. What happened outside that base that morning was documented by international news organizations and broadcast across social media in real time. Thousands of fans had gathered at the location, in numbers that required crowd management infrastructure and drew coverage from outlets that would not typically send reporters to a military discharge. The images that circulated, Jin emerging, the crowd's response, the reunion photographs with fellow BTS members who had come to welcome him back, functioned less like entertainment news and more like a cultural event with its own distinct emotional register. These were images of relief and recognition rather than celebrity excitement, and the distinction was legible in the faces of everyone photographed that day. Shortly after his discharge, Jin participated in carrying the Olympic torch as part of the Paris 2024 Summer Olympics torch relay, an invitation extended by the International Olympic Committee and the Paris Organizing Committee that placed him among the select group of global figures chosen to carry the flame in the days preceding the opening ceremony. The torch relay is one of the oldest ceremonial traditions in modern sport, and the selection of torchbearers is a deliberate act of cultural curation. Jin's inclusion positioned him not simply as a music celebrity, but as a recognized figure in a global public context that transcends any single industry. He returned to music and entertainment activities with a momentum that his 18-month absence had, paradoxically, amplified rather than diminished. His solo releases after discharge entered charts internationally, and his appearances in Korean entertainment spaces were met with the specific kind of warmth that comes not from manufactured hype, but from the genuine relief of an audience that had simply missed someone. That is a different kind of commercial force than algorithmic optimization produces. It is built from time and distance, and the sustained attention of people who waited. What Jin's chapter illustrates, in a way that no streaming figure fully captures, is the structural role he plays within the emotional architecture of BTS's relationship with its audience. He was the first to go, which meant he was the first to return, and his return carried the implicit signal that the long pause was beginning to resolve, that the group that had given so much of its collective energy to a global audience was, one member at a time, coming back. His comeback was not just about Jin. It was about what Jin coming back meant for the larger story. That is why it sits at number one, not because of chart position or a festival slot or a fashion campaign, though all of those things have their own undeniable weight, but because the breakthrough Jin achieved was the hardest kind, the breakthrough of simply showing up again and having the world stop to notice. 7 members, 7 chapters, one group that, even scattered across military bases and solo schedules and individual milestones, somehow managed to make the whole story feel connected.